How's it going, everyone? So today we're working on this. We're actually in the middle of it, and I've been corresponding with a couple people recently over the last couple of months, and a lot of them are not familiar with small engines or engines in general. So I kind of want to go over basic concepts. It's going to be a lot of talking, not a whole lot of working, but I'm going to go over names, what stuff does, and general causes and problems that you can see if there's a problem with a particular part, and we'll go over it. We're not going to go over mower blades or anything. We're going to strictly go over motors, and that's it. So if you're looking for some type of help on why my blade isn't turning or why my pressure is low on my pump, that's not for this. Go ahead and find something else. In the meantime, grab a drink and let's go ahead and discuss motors. Okay, basics of the motor. This is the air filter. Well, there's an air filter inside there. This is just called an air filter cover. There's a lot of different names on it, but when someone refers to checking the air filter, remove the cover and then you check the air filter. Easy, done. Not that complicated. Spark plug. That just does exactly what it says. It creates a spark, and that's it. It ignites fuel, and that's a simple one and only job. Muffler cover, or guard, or shield. There's lots of different names for this little piece of metal on top of it, but that's not really too much of a common issue. And then muffler inside there, big steel box, that's it. Boom, done. That's not that complicated. This right here is what we call a kill, or kill switch. That just, if it's on, your motor is going to be running, ideally. If it's off, it should turn off, also ideally. Common problems with this would be the fact that maybe the wire is broken and it's not going to be making a good connection, so we potentially could not have any way to kill spark. What I mean by kill spark is this needs to be grounded out. When the coil, which we'll get to, creates electricity to go to the spark plug, in order to stop it, it needs to go to ground instead to the spark plug. So if the wire is broken, in this case it's actually really easy to see, it's this wire right here, then that's bad. So don't always make sure that if you're going to be using it, that it turns off and the wire's in good condition. If you can't see it, then that's really not much you can do, but if you can actually see like a break in it, stop, fix it. Obviously fuel tank, not too complicated there. This is called a choke. Chokes come in different everything, just like people. Some people are big, some people are small, some people, are intelligent, and some people are not the brightest bulb in the chandelier. Chokes are kind of like people. They're a little bit different. Some are easier, some are harder, some are auto, some are manual. This is what we call a manual choke. What that means is on the carburetor, which we'll get to, it will choke it off. And I'll show you what that means when you look at the carburetor. When it's off, which is normal when you're running it, it's letting airflow go in basically unobstructed, and that's it. If your choke is on and it's running, what you're going to get is a lot of black smoke and chugging and potentially dying, most likely eventually you're going to die, of your motor. So if you're getting a lot of black smoke, especially if you have an auto choke, look at the carburetor, I'll show you what I mean, and see if the choke is on or off. So that's the easy stuff. We're going to get into something a little bit more detailed. So there's two types of motors, generally. Overhead valve and a flathead. Now, we're not going to get into two cycles because those are completely different in most cases. But right now we have an overhead valve here. And if you want to get specific, this is technically an overhead cam. But in most motors, unless it's like these Hondas here, you'll never see the cam, which is actually this part. A cam basically is tied to the crankshaft, which we'll get to next or shortly. And it moves twice as fast as the crank. So if, let's say your engine's running at 1500 RPM, well, this is running at 3000. Is that right? No, half as fast, excuse me. So basically what it's job is to open and close the valves. And this one, the reason why I chose this is so it's easier to demonstrate. But normally cams inside, just hopefully we can all come to agreements with that. Normally it's inside of the motor and you'll never see it, but it will spin and it moves. Pretty easy, not too horrible. Now, this is going to be the little bit more difficult part. Each one of them are a little bit different, but they all do the same. So we're going to go over this one because it's fairly generic and take it from there. This is what you call a rocker arm. It rocks back and forth. Like I said, there's different types. Majority of the time it's going to look something along the lines of this. It's going to have a pivot point. It's going to have some point in there where you're going to either have a rod, or in this case the cam touching it itself, but something in the motor or on the cam is going to move it back and forth. And what that does is compresses the valve down, which allows that particular valve to perform its function. If it's by the carburetor, that's called the intake valve. If it's by the exhaust, that's called the exhaust valve. And intake valves open up to allow fuel in, exhaust valves open up to allow exhaust out. Pretty simple. The problem comes from, well, I guess there's really no problem, but these in general do need to be adjusted. It's a normal thing, happens to all motors, unless you have like in vehicles now you don't really have to do it because they're a little bit different, but in these are manually adjusted, and they're manually adjusted by these two screws. Now these are going to look widely different in every single situation. Just know there's going to be some type of rod or something in the rocker arm that's going to make contact with the valve, and some type of mechanism to hold it in place. In this case, it's just a screw that's being kind of compression held in place by a 10mm nut. And this screw, if you were to look at it, goes all the way down. In fact, you can look at it. It's pretty easy to take it out on this motor. This goes all the way down and touches the valve, which is our next thing. What is a valve? A valve, we're not going to look entirely at, but this is what we call a valve stem, valve spring, and this is a holder for the valve spring. Basically what this does is this spring is going to want to have this valve compressed against its mating surfaces in the inside of the motor, and that's basically its only purpose. It wants it to be compressed against that surface. If you ever heard of something called valve float, the reason why that happens is the engine spins so fast that the spring actually doesn't have enough power to push the valve all the way back into its, let's say, home position until the next revolution goes by, and then it starts opening again. That's called valve float. It's bad. Don't over rev your engine, and any engine really. So when I mean the valve stem, is there a little piece of metal, you can see it right here, it's actually the top of this valve, goes all the way down into the motor and then connects to, like say, the head of the valve, which is like a big circle. And that's it. Pretty simple. So if anyone says you need to adjust your valves, this is what they mean. You need to adjust the clearance in between that little piece and the valve, the top of the valve stem. Right now, this is comically large. You measure that in thousandths of an inch or the appropriate millimeter equivalent, and that's it. Look it up. Let's say this is a GC190, Google GC190 valve clearance. It's going to give you a couple specs. It's going to give you the intake and the exhaust spec. You just get a feeler gauge. A feeler gauge is a selection of thin pieces of metal. I have one right here. There's lots of different pieces, and they tell you what size they are on them, and you find the correct one. Easy. And you shove it in between the gap of this screw and the top of the valve head, or the top of the valve stem. That's it. So if you need to adjust your valves, that is the basics of it. If you need a full detailed version, I have videos on specific motors. Next, what do we want to go to next? Let's go to the front of the motor, shall we? The motor is pretty easy. Has a recoil cover or shroud, whatever they want to call it, and that's it. Behind this cover or shroud and the recoil is a big aluminum or cast iron or steel round disc. It's pretty thick and sometimes can be pretty heavy, and that's called a flywheel. A flywheel is just a big spinning piece of metal that helps the motor go through its cycle, and that's it. In addition to that, for small engines, there's magnets on it, and that magnet, not getting too technical, is what triggers the electrical spark for the spark plug. Electricity and magnetism have a marriage together, let's just put it that way, and the magnet allows it to create electricity to send to the spark plug. Beautiful system, works great. If you have something called a points and condenser, which we'll get into now. I don't have, this one is way too new for that, but you have a very old motor. Basically, the points, it's kind of like the valve clearance on what we were discussing. On the crank, there's something on there that pushes these 2 points, and they touch. And when they touch, the electricity is stored in the condenser, then gets released and goes to the spark plug. It's an old system, it has a lot of problems, and it's just generally, in my opinion, not good. If you want to restore a motor to its full and historical value, or whatever you want to consider it, then doing that should be fine. If you can upgrade to electronic ignition, which this has, I would always be a proponent for that. So, speaking of that, what is electric ignition? Well, right here is the spark plug boot, and on that spark plug boot, it goes on a spark plug. Now, if you were to go a little bit further in there, I'm going to try to grab one. You would go down and you would find something that looks and resembles like this. Remember I told you it's a big round spinning disc? Notice that this has like a round section. Well, when the magnet passes this, the magnetism interacts with the coil. Coil creates electricity, goes to the spark plug boot, goes to spark plug, goes to fuel, creates power. Boom, done. When someone says they don't have spark, majority of the time it's either this is grounding out somewhere, not very likely, can, but that's why you looked at your cable, or this is bad. These are not expensive, especially if you have like a Honda or Briggs. You can get aftermarket ones for pretty cheap and they're pretty decent. It's a very easy technology. It's hard to mess up even for aftermarket people, but don't get me wrong, they still do. But just make sure that you get a decent one if you do that. OEM's obviously better, but you know, I'm not responsible for your finances. Here's the thing though, if you are going to be changing it, there's going to be two things you want to remember. One, remember how I told you there's a gap in the valves? There's a gap in between the coil and the flywheel. That's about 1/10,000 of an inch. Some people use a business card, fold a couple pieces of paper together, whatever you want to do. Roughly 1/10,000 of an inch. If it gets too far, it's not going to create adequate spark. If it gets too close, the spinning of the motor, I mean, if it's already touching, that's bad. But the spinning of the motor might actually make the flywheel grow a little bit. It's called centrifugal force. That's what happens. And you potentially can start rubbing. Rubbing's bad because you can knock the magnet off and destroy your flywheel. Or in the process, you can also damage your coil, and then you have to buy both a coil and a flywheel. That's bad. Flywheels are expensive. Coils, not so much. But likelihood of you damaging both, fairly high. Don't do that. So, now that we have that done, let's go do something a little bit more basic to give our minds a rest, shall we? So unfortunately, this one doesn't have the system I was looking forward to, but I'll describe it pretty decently. But this is called a dipstick. It basically just dips into oil and gives you a reading. They all look different, they're all in different places, just look for it. This one's low. How you know that? There's usually notches in there. And it tells you full, low, overfilled, stuff like that. So follow the instructions. Now, if you have a filter, like an oil filter on there, you want to take that reading with a full filter. You don't want to just put a brand new filter in there, put oil till it says full, and then run it and assume it's going to be adequate. Don't do that. Full oil filter. Let it run for like a 30 seconds, 10 seconds, let's say 10 seconds, and let the oil filter fill up, and then check your oil. Clean it off with a clean rag, dip it back in. Bonus tip, Hondas, you don't screw in, you just put it so it's resting on the little piece of metal that it screws into, and then you read it. Most Hondas have a sticker, some don't, but that's how you check Hondas. Now, oil filter. Like I said, some have them, some don't. More commercial grade machines will have an oil filter, or larger machines will have an oil filter. If you do get one, make sure you get the right type. Ideally OEM. You can get a good aftermarket. Sten's is a good one. Not a sponsor or anything, but they do make pretty good products. But whatever you do, you can fill it before you put it on. Sometimes it becomes more of a hassle than anything else. But try to, if it doesn't come pre-lube, and what I mean by pre-lube is the O-ring where you screw it in. If it doesn't come pre-lubed, then you're going to want to put a little bit of oil on it. Clean, dirty doesn't really matter. Some people might have an issue with the dirty part, but it doesn't really matter. Anyway, back to it. Oil. Majority of these are going to be 10W30. If you live in a very cold climate, maybe a little less. If you live in a very warm climate, maybe a little thicker. But in general, 10W30 is a very good mixture in between what you need, and it should be fine, unless you read elsewhere. So a lot of times there's stickers. If there is a sticker, follow the rule of the sticker. If there's no sticker, you could even Google it. That is never a bad idea. Or you can just put 1030 in there and run the risk, but like I said, it's not really that big of a risk. Majority of them take 1030. Hondas take 1030. Conventional, synthetic, doesn't really matter. I mean, it's a small engine. It will be fine no matter what one you put in there. As long as there's oil in there and it's clean and you change it routinely, that's fine. Will you have to change it more routinely if you end up using conventional? Yeah, probably. But is it going to cause any issues? No. And people will probably go back and forth on that one. But it's a small engine, not a turboed anything. So just put whatever oil you need to. You also don't need to be super expensive with it. I've seen many motors run for hundreds of hours with cheap oil, and that's fine. But, I mean, there could always be a potential for, oil. That's about it. Sometimes you'll have a drain on the side like this. Sometimes you'll have a tube. Look at your oiling system. And if it's like a long tractor, like I said, they usually have tubes. Those are very useful. That way you don't have to get oil everywhere. You fill the same place, you put it there, boom, done. Not that hard. Going back a little bit, this is called the valve cover. It just covers the valves, pretty simple. I don't think I mentioned that yet. So this is a carburetor that actually probably would fit on this. It's obviously missing a few pieces, so bear with me. Actually, let's grab a different one. Then grab two. We have a wide range of carburetors in this garage, and we're not judgmental. So this one is actually probably very similar to the one that's on this machine. This is called a choke. You know this because this part goes towards the motor. Not going to get into how it works. If you want that, that's a different video. But this is a choke. This is a throttle. This is an inlet. This is a float bowl. And sometimes you have little adjusting screws. This one is what you consider a fix because there is no adjustment. Sometimes you will. I don't think any of the, here we go. Behind this little piece right here, there'll be a little screw, and you can screw it in and out, potentially. Maybe not this specific one, but That what you'd be considered a adjustment screw. Now, cleaning it, I have plenty of videos that need to clean it, so I'm not going to get into that, but that is the basics of it. Bowl nut, there would be a gasket on both ends of this. The one that goes through the motor is definitely 100% important. This one, if you lost it, you would want to replace it, but you could still use it today as long as you're not like in the middle of a dust storm or something. That gasket's primarily there to help with venting and also keep dirt out. Primer bulbs. This is a primer bulb. Remember I told you some of the motors have chokes? This is another system they have. Primer bulb. Just looks like this. Sometimes it's on the carburetor like this one. Sometimes it's somewhere else. But you just press it, and basically what ends up happening, I don't know if you can tell, but there's a small little goldish tube in there. That's called an emulsion tube. And fuel, when you prime it, or when you press this, this gets pressurized, the bottom of the carburetor, and shoots fuel up, and then when you pull on it, that fuel that's just chilling there goes into the motor and starts it running. And then from there, the natural vacuum of the motor will actually, here's another demonstration of a primer bulb. Anyway, the natural vacuum of the motor will continue on with the rest of it, and ideally if it's tuned right and cleaned correctly, it will run 100% normal, and that's it. So carburetors, while they're intricate sometimes, they're all basically the same, especially for small engines. So if someone refers to the choke on, that door means it's closed. If the choke is off, it means the door is open. Pretty easy. We don't have specifics or examples for these next parts because we're going to go into the center of the motor, or in the motor itself. Some of the common parts you would hear are a crankshaft. That is a spinning thick piece of metal that derives whatever the other end of it, blade, pump, doesn't matter. The other end is in the front, and that is usually connected to the flywheel, and then that spins the flywheel. Pretty easy. I guess not usually. It is connected to the flywheel. Cam, we know what a cam is, but most cams are inside. They do exactly the same thing, just in a different way. Boom, done. It could be something called a dipper. Basically, that is just a piece that moves the oil back and forth. I mean, it can get pretty intricate sometimes, like there's little passageways, but you know, we're not going to get into all that. Something you can, and we're not going to be able to see it quite. Oh, actually, no, we can on the other side. Okay, we're not going to see it, but there on the bottom of every motor, including your car motor, there's a little hole, and then there's a vent for that hole. Crankcase pressure builds up when the piston going up and down. Compression goes from the top of the cylinder and usually goes out the muffler. However, sometimes it goes into the crankcase, which is this big part beneath everything. This big area is called the crankcase. There needs to be a place to relieve that pressure. So, have you ever heard of direct injection engines having issues? It's because their crankcase goes into their air filter, goes into their air intake, which all of them do. They'd have an issue because for different reasons, but all engines do that. All the crankcase vents go into the intake. All those vapors get burned again. Boom, done. You can buy kits probably for, maybe not for small motors, but definitely for cars to eliminate that, and it could be a benefit. But for small motors, it's going to be somewhere on the motor. And in our case, I don't know how well you can tell. If you have a motor that has a fuel pump, which this is our fuel pump on this one, the crankcase vent is almost always connected to the pump because that vent actually has a vacuum as well and moves this little piece of rubber-ish material back and forth and creates pump-like action and moves fuel from the tank to the carburetor. Most carburetors are what they called gravity fed, which means the tank has to be higher than the carburetor. That's why the carburetor is usually fairly mid-level and the tank is usually fairly high. That's why. In this situation, we don't have that ability, so we have to have a pump bonus tip, if you don't have a pump, never use a paper filter. You can use a filter, just make sure it's one of the red or white ones, because those are screens. They're not filters per se. They're more of a screen. A paper filter might work, but you're going to be restricting flow in a gravity-fed system, so don't use that. If you have a pump, feel free to put a paper filter in as much as you want. That's not a problem. So we're going to go kind of back to the oiling. It's not really considered oil problem or issue or anything, but there's sometimes what they call a low oil sensor. Now, we don't have it because we just have an on and off switch, but somewhere, usually next to the switch, there's going to be a lot of wiring, and there's going to be like a wire going directly somewhere beneath, generally, where the fill is, or at least close to the fill. And that wire goes into a sensor. Basically, if it sees oil, it allows spark to continue on as normal. If it doesn't see oil, then it kills spark by grounding out. And that is meant to save your motor. So if your oil level gets too low, then it stops it from running. That is a benefit and a hindrance, because sometimes those can go out. The good versions you can remove and replace externally. Some of them you have to remove and repair internally. That's not as good. So if you are running into a situation where you have no spark, check the oil level. You very well might have a kill issue, and if it's at the right level and it's still not having spark, disconnect that wire. Don't cut it. There's usually a connection somewhere. Disconnect the wire that's going to the motor and follow wherever it goes. Disconnect it, and that will remove it entirely from the system, and you should be fine. Just make sure to replace it or keep a very close eye on your oil level. And that's it. That is a very basic overview of these motors. Now I can get into the specifics if you want. We can get into specifics of something else. Leave a comment below what you want to get into specifics of. But the only other thing I can say is there's 4 things we need to have a motor run. Compression, which is the spark plug, the piston going up and down, which I guess I didn't just go over. So there's a piston, which is a round disc, has a connecting rod. That is a rod that goes from the piston to the crankshaft, and when the crankshaft moves, it moves the piston up and down. Pretty simple. So when they mean compression, that is the piston going up to the top of its travel on the top of the head, and the space is getting more and more compressed. That's compression. Spark, we know that. Fuel, we know that. And air, we know that. That's coming from the air filter and the carburetor. Well, fuel and air is coming from the carburetor. In addition, we need something called timing. Timing, remember the flywheel and the magnets? The magnets are put on there specifically in specific places, and the flywheel is installed specifically on a specific location, so that time when the spark can go on is the same every time. Is that ideal? Probably not, but it works pretty good, and we don't have to worry about our machine being out of time. Now, if for any reason, this happens a lot on lawnmowers, you hit something, there's something called a flywheel key. Some people call it Woodruff key, whatever you want to call it. It's a very soft piece of metal that will often case break and allow this flywheel to spin freely, putting it out of time. Because if it didn't, remember I told you it uses that momentum, it could potentially damage itself. Well, if that momentum continues to spin without damaging anything, that's a better scenario. That just means you have to replace the key instead of the motor. So it's a good system. So, anyway, now we discussed that part. We should be pretty much golden now. We went over the carburetor, all the specific parts in the motor. Like I said, if we want to get in specifics, we definitely can, so leave a comment below on what you want to look at. But they're not that complicated, and a lot of times it's, per motor, so the specifics might change, but we went over quite a bit. Hopefully this helped. If you're having a little hard time and you read or watch videos and you're hearing these, jargons coming from people, hopefully this video helped explain a little bit of that jargon. So I'm going to leave it at that. Follow me on Instagram at SmallEngine101. If you like what you see, keep watching, subscribe. Definitely leave a thumbs up. And if this helped you out, put a thumbs up because that helps me out. And I will catch you on the next video. You have a good night.